"Take that off," the cruel judge yelled at a poor nurse. Then the Vampire King stood up. The courthouse on Meridian Street had a reputation. Not the good kind. Everyone in the city of Velthorn knew that if you walked into Judge Harlan Oss's courtroom without money, without connections, without a last name that carried weight, you were already guilty before you opened your mouth. The marble floors were polished to a mirror shine, the wooden benches were carved from expensive oak, and the air conditioning worked perfectly in every room except the public gallery, where ordinary people sat sweating through their clothes. Marin Calloway had never been to a courthouse before. She stood outside the heavy double doors in her pale blue nurse's scrubs, clutching a manila folder to her chest like it was a life vest. 26 years old, 5'4", with dark circles under her brown eyes that told the story of a woman who hadn't slept properly in 3 weeks. Her hair was pulled back in a tight bun, not because she cared about looking professional today, but because she hadn't had time to wash it properly between her overnight shift and this hearing. The case was simple on paper. Marin worked the night shift at Velthorn General Hospital's pediatric ward. 3 weeks ago, a child named Toby, 7 years old, asthma, history of bad reactions to certain medications, had been brought in by his grandmother after his stepfather, Donal Ricketts, had given him the wrong dosage of a new prescription. Marin had caught it. She had flagged it in the system, documented everything according to protocol, and the child had been treated and released safely. The problem was that Donal Ricketts was the nephew of Judge Harlan Oss, and somewhere between the hospital and the legal system, the story had been twisted into something unrecognizable. Suddenly Marin was the one being accused of falsifying medical records, of negligence, of attempting to create a false narrative to cover her own errors. The hospital's legal department had offered her representation, then quietly withdrawn it when Judge Oss's name was mentioned. Her union rep had gotten her a lawyer, a tired, overworked man named Philip Crane, who had spent most of their one meeting on his phone. She pushed open the courtroom doors alone. The gallery was half full, which surprised her. She recognized a few of her co-workers from the night shift, Dava, who worked in radiology, and old Mr. Fenwick from maintenance, who always brought her coffee at 3 a.m. They'd come to support her, and the sight of their faces made her throat tighten. What she didn't recognize was the man sitting in the back row. He was tall, impossibly tall, in the way that certain people seem to take up more space than the room allows. He wore a black suit with no tie, the top button of his white shirt undone, and he was sitting with his long legs stretched out in front of him with the casual ease of someone who had absolutely nowhere else to be, and no one who would dare tell him otherwise. His hair was dark, almost black, pushed back from a face that was, well. Marin noticed it for half a second, and then forced herself to look away, because noticing things like that was not why she was here. His name, though she didn't know it yet, was Caspian Vale, and the reason he was sitting in Judge Harlan Oss's courtroom on a Tuesday morning had nothing to do with Marin Calloway. Not yet. Caspian had lived long enough, several centuries long enough, to have developed a very specific radar for injustice. Not the dramatic, explosive kind, the quiet kind, the institutional kind that wore three-piece suits and used procedural language to dress up cruelty. He had been in Velthorn for 2 weeks on entirely different business, the particulars of which involved old agreements between the Vale bloodline and certain establishments in the city. He had wandered into this courthouse to sign some paperwork on a property acquisition, and had ended up in this courtroom because he'd walked past the doors and heard, through the thick wood, a woman's voice, clear, honest, slightly terrified, saying, "I was only trying to help the child." He had sat down. He didn't know why exactly, or perhaps he did, and he was choosing not to examine it too carefully. Judge Harlan Oss entered at 9:07 a.m., 7 minutes late, in a way that communicated very clearly that the lateness was intentional. He was 61, heavy-set, with jowls that shook slightly when he walked and eyes that were the color of old dishwater. He settled into his chair with the satisfaction of a man who had never once questioned whether he deserved to be there. "Let's get this moving," he said, not looking up from his papers. "The matter of Ricketts versus Calloway." Marin's lawyer stood, shuffled some papers, and began to speak. He was competent enough. He laid out the timeline, presented the documented evidence, spoke about protocol and procedure. Marin had actually documented everything meticulously. She was that kind of nurse, the kind who wrote things down, who checked twice, who left nothing to interpretation. The problem was that documentation meant nothing when the judge was already writing a different ending. It happened 40 minutes into the hearing. Oss had been dismissive throughout, interrupting her lawyer mid-sentence, sighing heavily, making notes with the performative energy of a man who had already decided. Marin sat at the plaintiff's table with her hands flat on the surface in front of her, because that was the only way she could keep them from shaking. Then the judge looked up at her directly for the first time. His eyes dropped to the small silver pin on her scrubs, a tiny cross with an enamel bluebird on it, a gift from the grandmother of a patient she'd helped last Christmas. She wore it every shift. It had become something like a talisman. "Nurse Calloway," Oss said, his voice taking on the particular tone of a man who has decided to enjoy himself, "is that a religious symbol on your uniform?" Marin blinked. "It's yes, sir, it was a gift." "This is a court of law." He leaned forward. "Not a chapel, not a hospital ward. You will remove that pin immediately. We don't perform for the cameras in my courtroom." There were no cameras. The gallery went very quiet. Marin looked down at the pin. She had worn it through 15-hour shifts, through a global health crisis, through 3 years of a night shift that had aged her in ways a 26-year-old shouldn't be aged. She had worn it the night she held a 4-year-old girl's hand, while the child's parents were called in after a car accident. She had worn it when she'd stayed 2 hours past the end of her shift to sit with an elderly man who had no family and was frightened. "Take that off," Oss said again, louder, and there was something ugly in his enjoyment of it. "Now, or I'll find you in contempt." Marin's hand moved toward the pin. And that was when, from the back row of the gallery, someone stood up. Caspian Vale stood up slowly. He did everything slowly. Not because he was uncertain, quite the opposite. He had simply learned, over a very long life, that the most powerful thing a person could do in a room full of noise was to move through it like there was no noise at all. He buttoned the middle button of his jacket as he rose. He straightened his cuff. Then he walked, not quickly, not urgently, down the center aisle of the courtroom, past the rows of benches, past the wooden divider that separated the gallery from the court floor, and he opened the small gate in the railing and walked through it. The bailiff near the door took one step forward and then, inexplicably, stopped. Judge Oss looked up. "Who are you?" Oss demanded. "This is not the time for public commentary. Sit down or I will have you removed." "You won't," Caspian said pleasantly. His voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. It was the kind of voice that had a texture to it, like dark wood or deep water, and it had a way of making everything else in a room seem like background noise. Oss's face went red. "I beg your pardon." "I'm quite sure you do." Caspian reached the plaintiff's table and stood beside it, not behind Marin, not in front of her but beside her, which was a specific choice. He glanced briefly at Marin, and his expression was calm in a way that was, somehow, completely different from coldness. He looked back at the judge. "My name is Caspian Vale. I'll spare you the full accounting of what that means, though I suspect your clerk can look it up quickly enough. I have some interest in this proceeding." He paused, specifically in the part where you instructed a woman to remove a personal item that has no legal, procedural, or ethical basis for removal in these proceedings. "There is every basis." "Name it." Silence. Oss's mouth worked. "This is highly irregular." "The request was irregular. I'm simply responding to it." Caspian picked up the folder of documents on the table in front of Marin, her documentation, her records, and began to read through it with the air of a man who had all the time in the world. "Nurse Calloway, you don't need to remove your pin." Marin stared at him. Who are you?" "I'm working on being helpful," he said, which wasn't really an answer. "I'll explain the rest later." The clerk, a young woman named Bet who had worked in Judge Oss's courtroom for 4 years and had been quietly appalled for most of them, pulled up the name on her system and went very still. She wrote something on a piece of paper and walked it to the bailiff, who read it and went equally still, and then walked it hesitantly to the bench. Judge Oss read the paper. His red face did something complicated. The Vale family were not Velthorn royalty in the traditional sense. They were something older than that. The city of Velthorn had been built 300 years ago on land that had been granted through an agreement that was, technically, still legally binding by the Vale bloodline. The Vales had been here before the courthouse, before the marble floors, before Harlan Oss's grandfather had first bought his way into local politics. They were also, as the note reminded him in Bet's careful handwriting, not entirely human. Velthorn was that kind of city. It had that kind of history. Oss set the paper down. "Mr. Vale," he said, and his voice had lost most of its performance. This is still highly irregular." "Let's talk about what's regular," Caspian said, still reading through the documents. He held up a page. "This incident report was filed at 11:43 p.m. The child's prescription dosage issue was flagged at 11:39 p.m. The chain of documentation is complete, unbroken, and witnessed by 2 additional staff members." He set the page down and looked up. "The charges in this case have no foundation." "That is for this court to determine." "Then determine it with the actual evidence." His tone remained level, even pleasant. "And without using your position to humiliate the woman who caught a medication error that could have harmed a child, before it harmed a child." The gallery was absolutely silent. Marin's hands were still flat on the table in front of her. She was looking at this man, this stranger who had walked in and stood beside her with the confidence of someone who had never, in his entire life, been made to feel small, and she was trying to understand what was happening. "I want a full review of the charges," Caspian continued, turning back to the judge. "I want the evidence submitted properly, and I want this proceeding continue to a later date before a different judge, given the rather obvious conflict of interest that this court has not seen fit to disclose." Oss's jaw tightened. "You have no standing to make those requests." "My family's legal standing in this city predates your legal system by approximately 230 years. He said it without heat, without triumph, just factually. "I have extraordinary standing. I'm asking you to use what remains of your professional judgment to do the right thing before this becomes significantly more complicated for everyone involved." There was a long pause. Then Oss said very quietly, "We'll recess." In the hallway outside, Marin leaned against the cold marble wall and breathed. Dava from radiology appeared at her side and grabbed her arm. "Who is that man? Where did he come from?" "I have no idea," Marin said honestly. Caspian came through the courtroom doors a moment later. Without the high ceilings and formal architecture around him, he was somehow both more and less overwhelming, more, because she could see clearly now that he was quite unusually striking, and less because he'd undone that top button again and was checking something on his phone with a slight frown, which made him look almost normal. "Almost." "Thank you," Marin said. I don't know why you did that, but thank you." He looked up. His eyes were dark grey, she noticed, with something in them that she couldn't quite categorize. Not coldness, not warmth exactly, something older than both. "I heard you say you were trying to help the child," he said simply. "Through the door." She blinked. That's why you came in." "Is that an insufficient reason?" She didn't know what to say to that. "The case isn't finished," he added. "Today bought time. Oss will resist the reassignment. He has procedural tools to slow things down. You need proper representation." He paused. "I know a lawyer, a good one, not tired." "I can't afford." "I'm not asking you to pay for it." He said it matter-of-factly, with no sense of charity or condescension, just fact. "I'm offering because the situation is unjust. I don't enjoy unjust situations." Marin looked at him for a long moment. "Why not?" she said. The question surprised him. She could see that, a slight shift in his expression, something that might have been the beginning of a smile. "Long story," he said. "I have time," she said. "I'm on night shift." She didn't mean for it to become a conversation. She had agreed to meet his lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Petra Voss, who arrived at the small coffee shop near the hospital at 4 p.m. with a briefcase, a tablet, and zero tolerance for procedural games. Within 2 hours, Petra had reviewed Marin's documentation and announced, with something close to satisfaction, that the case against Marin was aggressively thin, and that she was going to enjoy dismantling it. Marin had felt, for the first time in 3 weeks, like she could breathe. Caspian had come to the coffee shop too. He'd sat at a corner table with an espresso. He didn't drink and watched the proceedings without participating, because Petra didn't need his participation, and everyone in the room understood that. Afterward, Petra left, and Marin and Caspian were somehow still sitting across from each other. So Marin said. So he agreed. The Vale family. She'd looked it up in the courthouse hallway briefly on her phone. What she'd found had been partial, old, and slightly difficult to make sense of. You've been in Velthorn for a long time. My family has, he said. I've been in and out. The clerk's note said. She stopped. What did it say? She looked at him. That you're not entirely human. He was quiet for a moment. Then, what do you think about that? She considered the question seriously because she was the kind of person who considered things seriously. I think, she said slowly, that you walked into that courtroom and stood next to me when you didn't have to, and you didn't make it about you, you made it about the evidence. She paused. That's more than most humans have done. Something moved in his expression, that almost smile again. What are you? She asked. Old, he said. That's not an answer. It's the most accurate one. He looked at the untouched espresso. My bloodline is what your histories tend to call vampiric, though the details are less dramatic than the word implies. Marin absorbed this. Less dramatic how? I don't turn into a bat, he said, with the dry patience of someone who had answered this question before. Or burn in sunlight, though I find it uncomfortable. I don't require an invitation to enter buildings. I do require blood to sustain certain functions, but I have arrangements for that which don't involve unwilling participants, and I find the whole thing rather more medical than Gothic. She had spent 4 years treating human bodies in various states of crisis. She was not, by nature, easy to shock. Okay, she said. He looked at her. Okay, he repeated. I'm a nurse, she said. My orientation of what's normal shifted substantially during my first year in the ER. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. What brought you to Velthorn now? He told her, briefly, the property matter, the old agreements, the administrative tedium of centuries-old arrangements that still required someone to sign paperwork in person. And then you walked past the courtroom, she said. And then I walked past the courtroom. She looked at him directly. Why did you really stop? He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the evening traffic was thickening, and the coffee shop's lights had shifted to their warmer evening setting, and Marin had her second shift at the hospital in 4 hours. Because the cruelty was unnecessary, he said finally. He wasn't doing it because there was a legal reason. He was doing it because he could, because he stopped. Because you were someone he thought couldn't push back, and I find that, he chose the word deliberately, intolerable. You've seen a lot of that, Marin said, not a question. Centuries of it. Does it get easier, watching? No, he said, which is probably why I don't watch. She went to her shift. He didn't leave Velthorn. His property business was technically concluded within the next 2 days, but he stayed. He told himself it was because Petra had requested his presence in case of further legal complications, which was true. He did not examine the rest of his reasons too carefully. Marin noticed, the way she noticed most things quietly, without making a production of it. She was working a stretch of 5 consecutive night shifts, which meant she slept during the day and moved through the rest of the world in that slightly sideways way that night shift workers develop, always slightly out of sync with the rhythms everyone else takes for granted. She saw Caspian in the evenings, in the windows between sleeping and working. Coffee that was actually coffee for her and largely theatrical for him. Brief conversations that kept not being brief. She told him about the patients she couldn't stop thinking about, not their names or details, but the weight of them, the way some cases stayed with you. He told her, carefully at first and then less carefully, about things he had seen in 300 years that had the same quality, the kind that settle into you and don't leave. You remember all of it, she asked one evening, everything in that much detail. Yes. She thought about that. Is that hard? Some of it, he said. Some of it is, he paused. It depends on what you're remembering. She didn't push, but 2 nights later, he told her about a city he'd lived in during a very bad century, and a woman who had run a small clinic in the middle of a war with no resources and absolute stubbornness, and how he had helped her quietly from the edges. You do that a lot, Marin said, from the edges. It's usually the appropriate position. Not always, she said. He looked at her. You didn't stay at the edges in the courtroom, she said. The hearing reconvened 12 days later, before a different judge, the Honourable Sable Nkrumah, who had a reputation for being humorlessly fair, which was exactly what was required. Petra had filed for the reassignment on 3 separate procedural grounds, all of them airtight. Judge Oss had filed objections. They had been denied. Caspian had not said much about the legal manoeuvring. He had simply been there, available, in the evenings when Marin came off shift and needed to sit quietly with someone who wasn't going to ask her how she was feeling in a way that required a performance. She had stopped asking herself why she was comfortable with him. She wasn't sure when it had happened exactly, that shift from gratitude to something that felt more like recognition. Like she had been describing a shape for a long time without having the word for it, and now here was the word, standing in the corner of a coffee shop at 8 p.m. looking very tall and slightly uncomfortable because the chair was too small. She was, she thought, in significant trouble. And from the way he looked at her sometimes, carefully, like he was aware of the looking and concerned about the implications of it, she suspected she wasn't alone in that. The morning of the reconvened hearing, it rained. Marin stood outside the courthouse in her scrubs. She'd come directly from her shift, hadn't had time to change, with a paper cup of coffee and the particular steadiness of someone who has run out of room for fear, and has arrived on the other side of it at something close to calm. Caspian appeared beside her. He had an umbrella which he positioned over her without comment. You don't need that, she said. You said sunlight bothers you, not rain. It's for you, he said patiently. She looked up at him. He was watching the courthouse doors with his usual expression, alert, settled, present. Whatever happens today, she said, I want you to know that what you did that first day. The case isn't finished yet, he said. I know, but the fact that someone, she stopped, reorganized, the fact that you stood up, not for a dramatic reason, not because you had to, just because it was wrong. She shook her head slightly. That matters. He looked at her then, really looked, in the direct way he had that took some getting used to, like he wasn't afraid of what he'd find. Come on, he said quietly, let's go finish this. The courtroom under Judge Nkrumah was a different atmosphere entirely. She was 53, with natural grey hair and reading glasses on a chain, and she ran her courtroom with the brisk efficiency of someone who believed that justice delayed was justice corrupted, and she personally refused to be responsible for either. Petra Voss presented Marin's case with the systematic pleasure of someone laying out a very clean argument. The documentation, the timeline, the witnesses, both of the staff members who had been present that night, who had previously been too nervous to come forward and were now, with Petra's careful preparation, clear and credible. She presented the hospital's internal review, which had, quietly and without announcement, cleared Marin of any wrongdoing 6 days after the initial charges, a document that somehow hadn't made it into the original proceeding. Judge Nkrumah looked at this document for a long time. Then she looked at the opposing counsel, a young lawyer from the Ricketts family's firm, who had the look of someone who had recently realized he was on the wrong side of this. Counsel, she said, would you like to explain why this review wasn't included in the initial filing? The young lawyer said several things in quick succession, none of which were particularly useful. Marin was called to give her account. She had been dreading this, the public version of what had already been replayed in her head hundreds of times. But when she sat down and began to speak, what came out was simply the truth, told plainly in the order it happened. She was not performing. She was not defending. She was just describing what she had seen and what she had done and why. She talked about the child, about Toby, 7 years old, with his dinosaur sneakers and his grandmother holding his hand, and his oxygen levels dropping, and Marin pulling the medication file and reading the numbers and knowing immediately that something was wrong. I flagged it, she said. I documented it. I told the attending. Toby was treated and stabilized. He went home safe. She paused. That's what I'm supposed to do. That's all I did. Judge Nkrumah looked at her over her reading glasses. And you've been dealing with these charges for how long? 3 weeks, Marin said. Nkrumah wrote something. Her expression didn't change, but there was something in the set of her mouth that suggested she had already made up her mind. The opposing counsel made their case, such as it was. It was, as Petra had predicted, aggressively thin. The argument rested on a re-examination of the timestamps, a claim that Marin's documentation had been altered after the fact. Petra dismantled this in approximately 8 minutes using the hospital's IT records, which showed no alterations, and the testimony of the IT supervisor, who confirmed this clearly and with some impatience. The second argument rested on character testimony from Donal Ricketts himself, who appeared in a suit that cost more than Marin's monthly rent and spoke about his concern for his stepson and his conviction that the nurse had acted improperly. He was a reasonable performer. Petra cross-examined him. She asked gently about the prescription itself, about who had filled it, about whether the dosage instructions had been read carefully, about the pharmacist's record of the explanation given at the counter. Donal Ricketts's reasonable performance began to develop cracks at approximately the 12-minute mark. By the time Petra was finished, the picture was complete. A man who had made a careless mistake, endangered a child, and then used his family connection to a judge to redirect blame at the nurse who had prevented that mistake from becoming a tragedy. Judge Nkrumah did not take long to deliberate. I'm dismissing all charges against Nurse Calloway, she said, with a note in this court's record that the original case was filed without sufficient evidentiary basis and in circumstances that suggest an inappropriate conflict of interest. She set down her pen. I'll be referring the question of Judge Oss's involvement to the Judicial Oversight Board. That process will take its own course. She looked at Marin directly. Nurse Calloway, the evidence in this case shows clearly that you acted with exemplary professional judgment and that your documentation was thorough and accurate. This court finds no wrongdoing on your part. You're free to go. Marin sat with that for a moment. Free to go. 3 weeks. 3 weeks of waking at 2 p.m. with the cold certainty that she had done something wrong, even though she knew she hadn't. 3 weeks of her colleagues' careful encouragement and her own brain's 3 a.m. interrogations. 3 weeks of carrying it. Done. She pressed her hands flat on the table, breathed once and said, "Thank you." In the hallway outside, Dava grabbed her and held on, which meant Marin had to hold on too, and she did, and it was fine. And then Dava was crying and old Mr. Fenwick from maintenance was patting her on the shoulder and saying, knew it all along, good girl. And Marin laughed despite herself. Petra was packing her briefcase with the satisfied briskness of work completed correctly. I'll send you the paperwork, she said, though I suspect you won't be hearing from that side of things again. She paused. You should look into whether the hospital owes you back pay for any administrative suspension. I can help with that if you want. Yes, Marin said. Thank you, really. Petra waved this off efficiently and left. Caspian was standing at the end of the hallway. Not in the center of it. Not with his arms open or his face arranged in any kind of performance. Just standing there, jacket buttoned, hands in his pockets, with the particular quality he had of being present without requiring anything from the moment. Marin walked toward him. When she reached him, she didn't say anything immediately. He didn't either. Outside, through the high courthouse windows, the rain had stopped, and there was a late morning light coming in that was very gold and made the old marble look warmer than it was. It's done, she said. Yes. She looked at him. I don't know how to thank you properly. You don't need to. I know I don't need to, she said. I want to. He was quiet for a moment. Then, have dinner with me. She blinked. That's how you want to be thanked. I'm not asking to be thanked, he said, and there was a slight shift in his expression that was, unmistakably, the thing she'd been glimpsing since the first day. the warmth that lived under the composed surface, careful and real, and not actually hidden as well as he seemed to think. I'm asking because I'd like to have dinner with you, separately from the gratitude question. Marin looked at him for a long moment. I sleep during the day, she said. I'm generally more functional in the evening, he said. We're compatible. She laughed. It came out a little rough from 3 weeks of not laughing, but it was genuine. Okay, she said, dinner. 6 months later. Marin got a commendation from Velthorne General's Board of Directors, a formal letter acknowledging her role in preventing a medication error and her consistent standard of patient care. It was placed in her file. Her co-workers taped a copy to the break room wall. She read it once and then went back to her shift, because that was who she was. The Judicial Oversight Review resulted in Judge Harlan Oss's suspension, pending further investigation. The process was slow, as those processes tend to be, but it was moving. Donal Ricketts, in a development that Petra found gratifying, was asked to attend a mandatory meeting with the hospital's Patient Safety Board regarding medication handling. Toby, 7 years old, Dinosaur Sneakers, was brought in for a routine checkup by his grandmother, who asked specifically to see the nice nurse who helped him. Marin was there. She was always there. Caspian Vale stayed in Velthorne. He was vague about how long he intended to stay, in the way that someone is vague when the answer might be as long as needed, and they aren't quite ready to say that plainly. He had an apartment near the old quarter, high ceilings, drafty windows, extensive bookshelves, all of which Marin had developed strong opinions about over the course of 6 months. He was learning what it looked like when she came off a difficult shift, the particular set of her shoulders, the way she made tea instead of coffee, the value of sitting in the same room without talking for a while. She was learning what it looked like when he was carrying something, centuries of somethings, and had decided to carry it alone, and the specific tone of voice required to make him put it down. It was, as these things tend to be, ongoing. One evening in late autumn, they were sitting in his apartment, Marin with her tea, Caspian with the particular vampire version of a drink that she had, after some negotiation, stopped looking at with scientific curiosity, and Marin was describing a case from her shift, one that had been difficult, one that had the weight to it. He listened. He didn't offer solutions. He didn't try to make it smaller. When she was done, she set down her cup and looked at him. That first day, she said, in the courtroom, when he told me to take it off, she touched the small pin on her scrubs, the enamel bluebird, she still wore it every shift. I was going to do it. I was already reaching for it. I know, he said. And then you stood up. She shook her head slightly. You didn't even know me. No, he agreed. Why does that matter to you? She asked. The not knowing you could have justified staying seated. He wasn't going to do permanent harm with that request. He was, Caspian said quietly, not the kind that shows up on a medical record, but the kind that tells a person what they're worth, what they're allowed to insist on. He looked at her steadily. I've watched that happen to too many people over too many years, the small cruelties that teach people to make themselves smaller. He paused. I don't sit for that. Marin was quiet for a moment. Then she leaned over and kissed him, not dramatically, not with the energy of a conclusion, but with the honest simplicity of someone who has thought about something for a long time and is simply done waiting. When she pulled back, there was a warmth in his expression that was fully visible now, not guarded, not restrained. I still want to thank you, she said. I still don't need you to, he said, but I'll accept that. She smiled. Good. Outside, Velthorne was doing what Velthorne did in late autumn, the old streets lit with evening light, the river reflecting the city back at itself, centuries layered on centuries, all of it ongoing. The courtroom on Meridian Street was still there, the marble floors still polished, but Bet, the clerk, had submitted a formal statement to the Oversight Board. 3 other cases were under review. Things move slowly, but they move. And the small enamel bluebird pin stayed exactly where it belonged. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs a reminder that standing up, even quietly, even unexpectedly, can change everything. If you want to watch the full extended stories, join my Patreon. The link is in the description below. Exclusive and uncensored episodes are available only on Patreon. Check the link in the description.